thank you for this warm and undeserved introduction. I'm not sure I'm going to live up to the expectations that were just set, but I'll do my best. It's lovely that you are here, and I hope I will actually take you through that journey using the empirical and theoretical research that I carried out with the help of 4 people, plus 1, and I'll explain. Alessandro Gerosa, of course.
Yeah, like a ghost.
A sort of partner in crime in this Oseo-driven endeavor onto hipsters and craft work. Plus, of course, on top of Alessandro, who has been a very, very nice companion throughout this journey. Also, I have been working on this project with 4 postdoctoral researchers, Gianmarco Peterlongo, Giulia Giorgi, Gaia Casagrande, and Marta Tonetta, who have helped me out with a lot of the empirical stuff that you'll see in a few minutes. So, of course, all the good stuff that you see here is most likely their merit, and the sort of crumbling theoretical development that you get towards the end is my bad. So, you know, tell me before I actually publish this if it makes any sense. That's the goal of today, I guess. Jokes aside, of course, I'm very grateful to be here. And again, this is an important milestone, I think, in this research trajectory, because I feel that what we see towards the end is probably one of the main outputs that I want this project to deliver, besides the empirical data that I will show you. So the theoretical goal is at the very center of the Craftwork project, which is a multi-methodological study that has a number of goals here, which are briefly sketched out. It wants to map the existence and distribution of what back then was this idea, this term that was really new, that nobody really sort of described in more precise detail, neo-craft work, across the European Union. So the empirical setting is that of the European Union, and saying this in the UK makes me cry. But yeah, that's what it is. It means the UK is not part of it. It wants to investigate the lived experiences, cultures, and practices of neo-craft work, broadly speaking, within a labor process framework, within different sectors and geographical areas in the European Union, questioning subjectivities and pathways to work. So how do people get to do these neo-craft jobs? How do they feel in relation to class location? We'll get to that, also referencing again the milestone or landmark book of Richard Oseo, which initiated this field of research. And ultimately the role of social media and digital platforms, which I anticipate I will not talk about that much, mainly because there is a paper about it, which I invite you to read, which has been published last year, like a few months ago actually, 2024 still, on the International Journal of Cultural Studies, where we sketch out the ways in which platforms, digital platforms, and particularly one of those, Instagram, actually represents the sort of setting at large within which social relations of production are being remediated by these workers in a way that is counterintuitive, because of course their job doesn't necessarily entail digital technology or social media in any particular way, but it still requires some kind of platform engagement in order to make it work. So if you want to know a little more about it, either we stay on and I'll show you the rest of the slides after this talk, or you read the paper, or you ask me in the Q&A, meaning there's not much of that immediately right away. I'm sure you are wondering, as many of the reviewers of the paper that we're trying to publish, what the hell is neo-craft work? Because it's kind of difficult to put it into a definition. So the goal Alessandro Gerosa and I had with the paper that was published on organization studies was to give a proper definition of neo-craft work on the basis of what existing research before us had put down. So the term was actually coined by Chris Land, who I'm aware many of you, at least some of you, will know. He's a professor of organization and work studies at the Anglia Ruskin University, who has earlier than others looked at craft beer and different types of new kinds of artisanal production practices, defining these as neo-craft, essentially setting down this idea that these are bringing some kind of innovation into the craft production as we traditionally, conventionally intend it, within the setting of a post-industrial imaginary that uses social media and digital technology, and that promises to those who get to that particular production practice a less alienated form of work, which was early on the trigger for me, because of course there is a Marxist element in here, alienation, and there is a number of things that are, for me, of course, have been at the center of a lot of my research before this. So we come with this in mind, we come with this definition that sees neocraft work as work that is traditionally considered to be low status or working class in a sort of conventional way, that is resignified into status-producing activities and conferred new meaningfulness by way of this craft. And that is the result of a specific process that we call discursive materiality, upon which a combination of the engagement with raw matter, hands, and the material work that typical craft work is about, is coupled with or complemented by, better put, a symbolic universe. I'll just quickly go to this before coming back to the neocraft definition. This is the actual sketch that we did with very poor design skills, showing how we essentially evolved. We see neocraft work not in an oppositional way to traditional craft work, but as a spectrum where the emphasis is actually put more on the discursive component as opposed to the skillful mastery and the material element that what traditional craft workers would do. But it doesn't mean that a potter can not be seen as a neocraft worker or the other way around, although these are more quirky practices in the context of craft. For instance, there are parts of Europe where baking is not a craft, and parts of Europe where, for instance, France, it's the oldest craft practice ever. And the same goes for craft beer and some of the more quirky others. Hello. It was referenced before. The main theoretical and empirical study prior to this, to an extent, on this topic was the book Masters of Craft by Richard Oseyo, which has a subtitle, which is still something I'm trying to grapple with. So the idea that those who do these types of jobs are essentially middle-class kids doing working-class jobs. Neocraft work presents a very interesting research setting because it defies occupational hierarchies as we are conventionally understanding them, and challenges existing boundaries of self-employment, entrepreneurship, and salaried work, and creative work. While we're here, we can put that into question as well. And on top of that, we, especially Alessandro Gerosa, brought forward this, of course, reference and important sort of cultural milieu within which neocraft emerges, which is that of hipster culture. Which is a term that has been quite contentious over academic and non-academic circles for a decade at least. But it actually sets the scene for a set of practices that actually occur mostly within urban neighborhoods undergoing gentrification, and that signifies, that actually marks the resignification process that some of these jobs are actually doing into forms of cool work. If you have ever been to a natural wine bar, you know what I'm talking about. And again, this is a sort of conceptual map, a sketch that wants to see in a more sort of comprehensive dimension how neocraft work is not just a matter of production. Of course, it's also a matter of consumption, because there's a huge consumption interest in these products that has different types of elements of interest, again, but I'm not going into that. And it brings into a new recombination these different elements: creative work, manual work, entrepreneurship, salaried work, in a question around identity, again. So the idea at the start of the core of the project is, why do these people do these jobs? And what brings them to that? But I had a problem at the start of the research. Where do I find these people? Because research on hipsters has a methodological problem, a conundrum, as it calls. How do you go and interview people who do not self-define as hipsters or neocrafters, right? So if you go to any sort of ordinary hipster in 2017, they would deny the very existence of the label. So, and of course, even more so, 27 countries have 27 different ways of understanding what is artisanal, what makes part of craft and what isn't craft. And this sort of discursive element, of course, is not present in any of those. So social media, as the existing research on this topic would suggest, are an important element where to display this discursive aspect. So I turn to digital spaces, and I'm very happy that Norce is here because, of course, digital methods were the way in which this was actually done. So we developed a large-scale mapping of 5 platforms, starting from hashtag research with using hashtags like artisan and artisanal. There is a long process of trial and error that preceded all this, and of course pain and cry and all of the different stages of the research. But we settled on these hashtags because they were the ones that were able to actually grasp the same subjects that the existing research on this topic was actually able to was interested into. And through a combination of say, more traditional digital methods research and a qualitative angle with an ethnographic content analysis, we focused on the individual accounts in a large data set, approximately 70,000 unique posts. And then we went through all of them. It was 5 of us, it was long, it was painful, but it gave us the possibility to map and sort of emerge from the ground up a number of these initiatives across the European Union. This is the coding scheme that we've used, which I can, of course, expand upon maybe later in the Q&A. The key bits here are the elements of resignification and marginal distinction that we essentially codified into the data on the basis of, again, theoretical research on the topic. And this led us to identify 346 cases, which of course, it seems like, I'm not sure if in English this works exactly the same way, but it feels, in Italian, we say the mountain that gives birth to the little mouse. So, you know, you have so much data. La montagna che partorisce il topolino. Never heard. Wow, okay. It feels a small number. It's actually quite a significant one, considering the amount of, the difficulties we had in actually getting to where we wanted to be, and the fact that it actually covers a lot of cases, a lot of countries, sorry, with, of course, a predominance of France and Italy, which is partially a methodological artifact because artisan and artisanal are French words, after all. But it actually reflects prior research that we did on where we would expect from existing data more of these cases to be found, and the main countries where we would expect these particular types of production practices. And this is a sketch of what they do. Of course, food and beverage, as the sort of quintessential neocraft category, is the most important one, is the most present, but you can also find that there are different others that are, of course, related to textile production, ceramics and pottery, and wood making, so also other more traditional craft that has been resignified. And hospitality work, of course, as I mentioned before, is also part of the scheme. And then we moved into the qualitative fieldwork. So we went to meet with these people. We conducted, so far, 77 semi-structured interviews. We hope to get to 100 by the end of the project this year, essentially, and conducted 20 ethnographic visits at these neocraft activities, essentially spending time within these places, talking to the people, talking to the workers, to the founders. Some of them are self-employed, some of them are leading sort of small entrepreneurial initiatives, some are working as salaried workers. It's not a big portion, unfortunately, and we did this throughout a number of different countries. This is a picture that relates to my fieldwork in Estonia in a gene production facility, which is the fieldwork I don't remember much about, for reasons that you can expect. The main output, let's say, well, there are different ones, but of course the one that I'm starting the sort of empirical part of the presentation today is that we want to, and I wanted to sort of dive deep into why this work is meaningful, what makes this a form of meaningful work. Of course, coincidentally, literature on meaningful work post-pandemic has grown and has become widespread. There's a number of different contributions that have started to essentially reproduce new work on a topic that has always been there for a long time, but has for a while been sort of in the background of other types of research and work. And our contribution, well, the two main things that we say about this, one is something that we say already in the article with Alessandro Gerosa. So it is perceived as meaningful by these workers because it is juxtaposed to essentially digital knowledge work. So it's the other side of the workers that I've studied for my PhD, so the freelancers and the reputation economy ones. At some point they get sort of fed up with these and they find that these are, to quote David Graeber, bullshit jobs that they want to escape. Hence, neocraft work becomes the beneficiary of different pathways of exit from digital knowledge work, and that they are sort of leading into forms of neocraft production on the basis of different motivations, which we are going to explore. And to explain this, we use Hartmut Rosa and want to bring at the center of a conversation on meaningful work the notion of resonance. If you are familiar with Hartmut Rosa, is a social theorist, a German social theorist who has written about social acceleration. Resonance is a concept that has a number of different sort of nuances in his writings. It's mainly related to the perception of time. But here we take that and essentially build upon the existing research on many meaningful work to describe how these people escape broken relationships with previous jobs and look for something else. And they want to fix their relationship with work, their identitarian relationship with work, in ways that lead them to manual work that is nonetheless resignified, so is sort of perceivedly cool. Just to give you an example, this guy says this is something that gives you a quality of life more than money, not working like a slave in the office or running like a madman who knows where. You start at 8, you have a sandwich in front of your computer and then go home. Artisanship gives you the confidence that another way of working is possible. This is just to give you a sort of quintessential quote that reproduces many of those that we have heard in our fieldwork. So the paper is currently under review, so if you are a reviewer of this paper, don't tell me or just accept it, I guess. It gives a sort of layered description of these exit strategies. We identify 3 types: gradual, lateral, and radical, which identify the ways in which these workers do not simply just snap and wake up one morning and become, potters, but they engage into this journey. So gradually means that this often takes different steps. So they start from sort of disenchantment with the original work that they do, and then they move into something else that becomes the gateway for the jump into craft work. Lateral, it means that they were working into a field that had something to do with creative work, with the creative side of craft in particular, and they are like fashion, for instance, and then they switch to more or less doing the same thing but in a neocraft setting. And radical is when they quit altogether. Again, going back to the discussion we had yesterday about the sort of Great Resignation kind of movement and the ways in which people actually disconnect from jobs that they don't like at some point. And these are some of the elements that underpin these journeys. So the constraints of waged work as we know it, so repetitive and daunting tasks, lack of autonomy, toxic work environments, you name it. But also the fulfillment of personal inclinations, the element of resonance that I mentioned before, the idea of rejoining with some sort of lost creativity. Many of them come from creative work. Creative work as essentially, through their sort of stories, you see that creative work is a broken promise. The whole Florida 2000 and something kind of literature that promised these workers that they would be able to reconcile their passion with the activity that they would earn money from. And this is the realization that this is no longer the case. and the search for something else. So in many ways, neocraft work has taken up this promise from the creative economy with the addition of the material element that brings the resonant aspect to the fore through a completely different angle. And of course, concerning also the pandemic, but not only that, a number of trigger events that make this possible, because it's not easy to actually sort of jump ship and move into a completely different sector. So some talk about the ways in which the pandemic has been able to call a sort of to be a sort of threshold, a moment in which they actually stopped from what they were doing before and then prepared for the move, and this was enabling for the new step in their career. Health issues, sometimes I fell ill because I was working too much, and then I'm going now to do something else that fits me better. Travels, experiences of different kinds are also at the heart of these decisions in many cases. So again, a bit of a roundup of different interview experts.
But climate change, why?
Climate change is we put it there also because it's a sort of something that we would like to explore more, but it relates essentially to the frenzy about sustainability in some of these sectors. So the fact that you want to produce something, you are in an industry that produces something that you feel is polluting the planet and want to go and do something that is actually less impactful on the planet. It's not all of them, of course, talk about this. It's a minor fraction, but it's there, yeah. So this is a participant, a French living in Berlin, who again did this lateral exit, as we talked about that, because basically he worked a lot for this fashion platform. He was digital communication something, and he didn't like the way they treated him, and he expected payback because of all the work that he did. He didn't receive it, and at some point he said, look, I know all kinds of things here, I'll just go do something else. He became a potter, but he's also an influencer of pottery, so in case you were wondering. There is an element of that too. Some more, just as a sort of to give you more of the picture, the bigger picture. This is a bike repairer from Parma in Italy, who essentially used to work as a waiter in hospitality, has a sort of significant part of your career, of his career in hospitality. And then, of course, with the pandemic, bars and restaurants closed down. So he said, I'm not going to go back anymore. And I want to work on bikes. And bikes used to be, of course, a sort of side job that he used to do mainly for friends. And he wanted to turn this into his actual main work. This is an interesting story because, and I'm anticipating an element that I'm introducing later, the degree of romanticization of these stories is incredible. So this is actually one of the more grounded stories that we have collected because, of course, he speaks very plainly about how he doesn't really make much money and how the money that he makes is barely enough for him to live, and there are a number of different strategies of coping, let's say, that he puts into practice only to pursue this endeavor. This is a jeweler, I think Italian as well, if I remember well, who again was employed as a salaried worker in a jewelry setting and just couldn't take it anymore and moved into essentially, she essentially founded a company with a partner, with a business partner, with the idea of looking for the creativity that the previous job actually suppressed in the way in which they were doing pieces in a sort of factory-like way. And these are two examples of the trigger events. In one case, which we'll see in a moment again, this lady talks about how the pandemic gave her the possibility to restart as a fashion designer, as a textile producer, more specifically, and of course health issues, who did the same. This is a Finnish participant, and this is actually I don't remember where this is from at the moment, but it's also somebody who tells us how health issues triggered this move into the new job. Very quickly, so we get to the interesting part, for me at least. This hides a number of contradictions. First one, I mentioned this, of course, the idea that digital platforms are absolutely necessary in order to make this work. So, and they don't like it. They call it a necessary evil, a hustle, a burden. So they have to work with Instagram. They have to, do what John Boy and Justus Reutermark call this display labor, but they don't really like it. But it's essential to distinguish themselves from ordinary craft. The discursive element is what brings this aspect to the fore. You can see how this French soap maker describes the way in which social media platforms have become integral to her work, despite she hates that. Second one, of course, is one of the things that we discovered throughout the fieldwork is that not all of these people are in hipster neighborhoods. They are much more widespread. And there is a subset of those who have made life decisions also to move away from the city. So there is a separate paper that we are working on which triggers different types of questions, including issues of rural gentrification in the moment that they bring this particular lifestyle in a place that is not really sort of set for this particular practices, or at least it's not the immediate the immediate setting in which you think about it. This is a third one, of course, which I in part referenced already when I talked about the bike maker, the bike repairer in Parma. Of course, there are a number of hidden issues that they don't really talk about unless you dig into the interview setting. And of course, the symbolic and cultural reward that comes from these jobs is often paired up with unstable income, a difficulty to make ends meet in many different ways, and a roster of practical challenges to make their neocraft engagement work. One thing that we're doing now, the digital methods research we did in 2022, now we are going back to the data set to find out who of those who didn't make it. So they closed in the span of 3 years. And I guess 10%, that's the sort of rough calculation that we made. We have to consolidate that. But 10% of those, it means around 30, they are not existing anymore. They were there in 2022 and they don't exist anymore. These are two more sort of vignettes, let's say. One is, this is Jonna, textile worker in, which I mentioned before, she gave her, of course, consent to be named, just to be clear, who left her job during the pandemic and set up a workspace in a small unit adjacent to her family home in the middle of nowhere, an hour away from Helsinki. And she essentially lives through Instagram in the way in which her clients come to her and she goes and picks them up at the local station and brings them to the workshop. And one interesting thing that she discussed with us was the possibility to open a local pop-up shop, and the question whether the local pop-up shop would be understood by the locals, knowing that her price tag is a little higher than what people normally buy at that, in that area. And this is one of the most fascinating ones. This is a couple who used to work in an advertising job in Berlin, and then founded an artisanal startup doing craft soda in Lisbon. So basically, they saved up and left for Lisbon in search for a better work-life balance. Again, what I mentioned before. So the idea of a work-life balance that would suit them better was at the sort of the very start of their life project. But then they used the cultural capital and skills that they developed in the advertising world to found this initiative. So they won a startup grant, and then they be able to develop this which is basically a copycat of what you call the hipster Berlin drink, Fritz Cola. Yes, it's not called. It's like a sort of different version of that. It's good though. I mean, I like it, but it's more artisanal. And our interview was fun because he spent 20 minutes talking about how he likes peeling lemons. So I know a lot about peeling lemons now. Yes. So of course, this is how, if we were to sit this through what Oseyo and Bourdieu have sort of sketched out. So Bourdieusian approach to all of this. And so the way in which people mix economic and social capital is sort of the center of a story where cultural capital and symbolic capital are sort of osmotically together, right? So the valorization of cultural capital in a Bourdieusian sense is made possible by a set of material resources, networks, money, savings, real estate, whatever you name it, and the combination of those leads to development of a social status, symbolic capital, reputation, you call it whatever you like, that also sort of goes back to cultural capital ultimately, because the discursive aspect is prominent here much more than the material one. But there is a problem in this theory. First of all, I'm not a Bourdieusian, I'm a Marxist. So how do I make sense of this in my language, right? In a language that is not this one, which of course is fine. I mean, I have nothing against this, but it doesn't really fit with the way I started approaching this project and the contribution that I envisaged. And then it turned into this question, what does neocraft work tell us about today's work more broadly? That is not only, that goes beyond, that extends, as you were setting this before, the idea of middle class kids doing working class jobs that was already actually in Oseo. So I think what we have here actually gives us a bit to think about in terms of class. That is a debate which resurfaces here and there in sociology. Neocraft work does one particular thing. So at once, it, on the one hand, complicates the role of work in Bourdieu, which some people have argued, sorry Roberto, is not properly acknowledged enough. In the way in which, of course, it gives prominence to cultural capital for a number of different ways in which the different capitals bring to, of course, the recombination of these different capitals brings to social status. But equally, questions the Marxist understanding of class, because this is a story of aspirational downward mobility, which makes no sense from a Marxist perspective. So the goal here, or the sort of the larger setting where I would like to get to a contribution, is to try and reconcile a notion of class as employment structure with the other notion of class that developed after Bourdieu, the work of Mike Savage, Beverly Skeggs. Some of the most important people in this debate are from this country, actually, which focuses on class as culture, practices, and identities. And in particular, to focus on this mythological notion of the middle class, which is increasingly problematic, I think. Now, this is a very local reference with John Prescott, which the British might remember, who said in 1997, at the peak of the Blair era, we are all middle class now. Well, good riddance. The middle class as a concept from a Marxist perspective is quite strange. It's a sort of 20th century invention in the way in which we talk about it now, which sits at the intersection of economic structures and cultural practices and social identities, and it's always been a relative one. So it is defined as opposed, like the other classes, one might argue, but it's still more than those, perhaps defined in a relative position. And it's a shifting social formation. It's what's left of the others, if you want to sort of like put it in very simple terms. Marx talked about, there you go, Caro, you wanted Marx, there it is. Marx talks about the middle class as an anomaly, which makes no sense in his scheme, or at least it does so as long as it at some point becomes either an allied of capital, which is what the labor process research has eventually sort of laid out clearly when it talks about the role of managers and supervisors in traditional manufacturing work, or a buffer group that then becomes proletarianized somehow, so that does the other sort of side of the scale. And these intermediary groups, he called them famously the petty bourgeoisie, as a class in evolution. It's not something that he really sort of put in a well sort of placed in a set position here. I'll leave the reference to Piketty because we have no time. But then again, the petty bourgeoisie is in Bourdieu. That is, if you read this, this is a piece from an article by Scott, 2017, which summarizes the concept of the petty bourgeoisie in Bourdieu, and it's actually the neocrafts. That's the people that we interviewed. The tastemakers, small craft production who coalesce around shared interest, refined dynamic and stylish tastes, fashions, cultural sensations, you know. The piece is about hipsters, and he concludes by saying, the hipster is a new petit bourgeois actor in new times. The problem is that this article looks at Bourdieu and not at the new times. So what are the new times about? The new times, I would argue, are more similar to what Eric Colin Wright argues about class. So the new times are about contradictory class locations. So people who eventually find themselves in the necessity to see themselves differently from what sort of class location they've been somewhat assigned to as they went into the workplace. And of course, Ellie Colin Wright talked about something else here. He talked about managers and professionals who have some control over labor but do not own capital. And he talks about these people as a group of people that is structurally unstable as a collective subject. Because, of course, some of these, but he saw this coming, right? He saw that many middle-class jobs were on course to be proletarianized. The labor process research did the same with the de-skilling thesis, which is also in creative labor. I'm thinking about the work of Chris Smith and Alan McKinley in particular, or absorbed into the ruling class. Finance, take, for instance, sort of clerks and financial, different types of financial and administration jobs that have become somewhat part of a ruling class. What he did not foresee, for obvious reasons, time in particular, that people could resignify bad jobs and gentrify them. And that was also possible. So the idea that I'm working on and that I hope will become the book of the project is this idea of gentrified labor to show that in relation to the notion that traditional white-collar jobs that we consider good jobs in the literature on sociology of work, today increasingly fail to deliver meaningful work. People get to resignify bad jobs, principled on the cultural valorization of authenticity and manual work, as a form of labor of distinction. This is a very recent article that actually made me go in a completely different direction. I really advise you to read it. It's a self-titled, so Labor of Distinction. It's on the American Sociological Review. And it talks about how rich people use butlers as a form of distinction. So sort of outsourcing the labor part to butlers, but the distinction part is on butlers. So the very rich, the ethnography that they conducted is on British aristocracy, sorry. So the way in which they choose wine is outsourced to the butler. And the theoretical framework that they talk about, so the way in which labor becomes an element of distinction, is very fitting with this. And I want to sort of expand and develop their scheme into the ways in which neo-craft workers use their labor as a form of distinction. And it says something also about emotional labor, which has been the sort of major framework under which many middle class and sort of pseudo-middle class service jobs have been understood, right? Because this, as I mentioned before, it's a very romanticized it's a context where people romanticize what they do a lot. But in many ways, what they do is a counter movement to the notion of emotional labor, which, if you remember that, it's based on the idea that we go into a job that we don't like and we act in it. So we bring forward something that is valorized that we don't like, and we perform different types of acting that then ultimately allow us to survive in that particular job. And again, this is sort of the other end of this process, where at some point we've come to the point that this acting is no longer bearable for some of these people, and that they find something else, even if this something else is, again, perhaps a reiteration of the creative class story, where still it's jobs that don't give you much money, but a lot of symbolic rewards. So this is where I am now. Please tell me if I should quit, because of course, no pun intended, and do not pursue this trajectory of where you don't see this working. I'm very happy for negative feedback as well, whatever feedback. I hope it was interesting, and of course, thank you very much for your attention.